Chapter 27, War and Peace, and of course the war we're talking about is World War II. The difference between our discussion this year and previous years is that we'll be looking at this through the eyes of the United States and how the United States was impacted by this war, why they entered this war, and who it affected. The road to Pearl Harbor. So the relationship between Japan and the United States pretty much deteriorated after Japan resumed its war against China in 1937. And in all honesty, neither the United States nor Japan desired war with one another. I think both sides had enough respect for the other to not just want to instigate a war. And Roosevelt really considered Germany to be more of a threat than Japan. And of course, he dreaded the prospect of a two-front war, like having to fight in Europe and having to fight in Asia. And so in the spring of 1941, the U.S. Secretary of State Cordell Hull demanded that Japan withdraw from China and promise not to attack the Dutch and French colonies in Southeast Asia. And people in Japan thought this was ridiculous, even moderates in Japan who weren't even totally on board with the militarism that was beginning to rise in Japan. Even the moderates didn't accept Hull's demand for total withdrawal. And in July 1941, the U.S. retaliated against Japan's occupation of Indochina, which was a French colony, by freezing Japanese assets in America and by placing an embargo on petroleum, which hurt their economy. Militarists at this point assumed full control of Japan's government, and they continued this pretense of negotiation with the United States. Secretly, though, they were preparing to implement war plans against the United States. And there was actually an American cryptanalyst, Colonel William Friedman, who cracked the Japanese code and figured out that an attack was coming in early December, probably in Asia, and he thought it was the Philippines. But in the hectic rush of events and everything going on, military and civilian authorities didn't really make useful effect of that information. So on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. And in less than 2 hours, they pretty much reduced the U.S. Pacific Fleet to ruin. 150 planes were wrecked, 2,400 people dead, 1,100 people wounded, ships destroyed. And so Congress declared war on Japan the following day. And then on December 11th, the Axis powers declared war on the United States. And it was at this point that World War I became known as the Great War. So at this point, we have to mobilize for war. And there were about 15 million men and women who entered the military, and they had to be fed, clothed, and supplies. And so in order to make that happen, Congress granted wide emergency powers to the president. However, because there was a slim majority of Democrats in both houses of Congress and a coalition of conservatives from both parties, it limited Roosevelt's freedom to act. So Roosevelt was an inspiring wartime leader, but he wasn't a great administrator. Nevertheless, his basic decisions did make sense, and these were his basic decisions regarding war. It included the financing of the war through taxes. Taxation was based on the ability to pay. They rationed scarce resources and consumer goods and regulated wages and prices. A lack of centralized authority sort of slowed down mobilization, but production still expanded dramatically. Manufacturing almost doubled, agricultural output rose 22%, and unemployment pretty much disappeared. The productive capacity and per capita output increased especially dramatically in the South. So what was the war economy like? Roosevelt selected a guy named James Burns to be his wartime economic czar, and James Burns actually resigned from the Supreme Court to do so. And then he headed to the Office of War Mobilization, which controlled production, consumption, prices, and priorities. The National War Labor Board arbitrated disputes and stabilized wages. Despite the rationing and the wage regulations, American civilians really experienced no hardships during the war. Strikes declined sharply. Prosperity and stiffer government controls strengthened organized labor. And in all honesty, the war did more to institutionalize collective bargaining than the New Deal had done. And so the war, in essence, affected a redistribution of wealth in America. In 1935, the wealthiest 1% of the population received 13.4% of the national income. And 9 years later, this 1% of the wealthiest received only 6.7%. And a lot of that was thanks to the income tax. The income tax was extended to nearly all Americans. Before, it excluded white-collar and industrial workers. Congress adopted the payroll deduction system. So basically, this came out of your paycheck before you even had a chance to give the money to the government on your own, to ensure its collection. And again, this was a steeply graduated income tax, and it did a lot to ensure wealth redistribution. War and social change. So Americans during World War II became more mobile. Not only were those in the military, those in the military were moved to training camps all over the U.S. and to Europe and to the Pacific, but wartime industries drew millions of civilians into new areas. And not to mention the prosperity that came during World War II allowed for new marriages and a higher birth rate. So there are actually several factors that improve the condition of Black Americans during World War II. For one, Hitler's racism made racism less respectable. Black leaders pointed out the inconsistency between fighting for democracy overseas and ignoring it at home. And by and large, blacks serving in the military were treated much more fairly than in World War I. The armed forces were still segregated, but they were treated better. The economic reality of this era actually helped blacks. Unemployment had affected blacks pretty disproportionately, but the labor shortage caused by the beginning of the war brought full employment. And so the unemployment rate among blacks decreased dramatically, as it had for everyone else. Not to mention, defense jobs often involved opportunities to develop valuable skills. And these were opportunities that racist policies of unions and employers had previously denied to blacks before the war. So blacks moved to the cities of the North, the Midwest, and the West Coast in order to hone new valuable skill sets to work in industries that they maybe hadn't even thought of before. Even though those that migrated to these cities had to live in urban ghettos, the fact that they were concentrated and the fact that blacks outside the South could vote gave them greater political clout. The NAACP grew in membership and influence. It also assumed a more activist role during World War II. But overall, the conditions for blacks improved during World War II. So Hispanics. The increased demand for labor led to a reversal of one of the policies that the government had put into place that forced Mexicans out of the Southwest. And so in Los Angeles especially, prejudice against Hispanics erupted into rioting against young men, especially young men wearing zoot suits. And zoot suits are like an outfit that has a broad-rimmed fedora, long coat, and peg trousers, and usually they're bright, bright colors. One of the worst riots took place in 1943. Rioting broke out when a group of sailors on leave began roaming LA, just attacking anyone in a zoot suit. So the condition for Hispanics grew worse in some places. Military service and mobility in search of employment did increase the American Indians' assimilation into white society. And that was something that really hadn't happened previously, but as they took jobs in the military or they were forced to move into cities to find jobs, they were, I guess, better assimilated into white society. So the treatment of German and Italian Americans. So in World War I, Germans were treated horribly. And in this war, there was less intolerance and repression of Germans and Italians. I think people were better able to separate the Germans living in America and the Germans living in Germany. And so in marked contrast to the First World War, Americans in this war were generally able to distinguish the enemy from the American. There were few Italian Americans that even supported Mussolini, and most German Americans were vehemently anti-fascist. At any rate, both groups were well organized and prepared to use their political influence if needed, but by and large, they received much less discrimination in this war. So in contrast to the treatment of Italian Americans or German Americans, 112,000 Japanese Americans, many of them who were even native born, were relocated into internment camps. The government feared that they would be potentially disloyal, and the public was aroused by racial prejudice and the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. And so the Supreme Court upheld restrictions on Japanese America. In one case, Hirabayashi versus the United States in 1943, the U.S. Supreme Court said that the United States can apply a curfew against a minority group, and it is constitutional if the nation is at war with that country. But all this began to unravel as the war came to an end. In Ex parte Endo in 1944, the Supreme Court finally forbade the internment of loyal Japanese American citizens. But overall, the racial tension between Americans and Japanese during this time was intense. So women's contribution to the war. There were millions of women who entered the workforce during the war, and more married women than ever worked outside of the home. And there was some initial reluctance by employers and unions, but women did make inroads into traditionally male domains. There were women who worked in shipyards and factories as welders and as taxi drivers. Black women had the double burden of race and gender, but because of the demand for labor, there were opportunities for them as well. There was prejudice in the workplace, and not to mention that, but working women also faced housework as well. So women were busy during this time, especially if they had a job and a family. The war did affect women who didn't take jobs as well. In families where they had to move to the city to find a job, there were women in a new place, living in tight living quarters with ration books and no friends. Children had to go to new schools, play on new playgrounds, make new friends, all of that. This wartime mobility did cause problems for women who faced new and sometimes difficult surroundings without traditional support networks. Women who married military husbands, they're called war brides, followed their husbands to training camps many times, and they faced problems comparable to those of women who moved to work in defense industries. In addition, they faced the fear and the emotional uncertainty of newlyweds, compounded by the separation from husbands who were risking their lives overseas. So the war definitely affected everyone, man, woman, and child. So we'll pick up in the next video with the Allied strategy.